So today we are going to be talking about intimacy and specifically the 4 different types of intimacy. So Megan, would you mind introducing us to the definition of intimacy and maybe talking about the 4 types that we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, sure. So intimacy is that idea that we talked about a little bit before in our last video, which is a closeness between 2 people. It's really genuinely knowing a person extremely closely. And for a lot of relationships, when we hear the word intimacy, we normally think about one of the 4 types that we're going to be talking about today, which is physical intimacy, which is, of course, sex, which is definitely a part of intimacy, but it is not the only part.
Yeah, I think that most people probably equate intimacy to the physical side first.
Is it fair to say that guys tend to be the ones that equate that more strongly to intimacy, or?
Yeah, I think that, sure, guys do. I think the girls also do it too.
So. Right. So maybe that's not really a fair statement.
Yeah, it's right. Probably fair some of the times.
Right. So I think that there's what kind of can get lost in translation, maybe also for men sometimes, is that there's this idea that if a lot of men feel like if they're physically intimate, that's intimacy, that's kind of like the be all end all, when in reality there could be other pieces that are missing. So let's just go ahead and jump into the other types. So besides physical intimacy, another type of intimacy that we have is experiential intimacy. So do you want to talk about that, Clay?
So the second type of intimacy that we'll talk about today is experiential, and that basically means doing stuff together. So not even necessarily talking during events. This could be taking a class together. It could be learning a new skill together. Like if you and I were to go to like some sort of art class or a cooking class, as long as we were doing that together, it would be building experiential intimacy.
Right. Or even, something as simple as working alongside each other, maybe on a project in the backyard, gardening, cooking together, even doing the dishes and chores together. That's experiential intimacy. And that closeness in activity is actually pretty important. And so if that's something that you find that you're not really getting to experience a lot of activity together, your relationship might be suffering from that. So then there's another type of intimacy.
Well, I wanted to say one other thing about that. So the way that I was thinking about experiential intimacy earlier was kind of from the standpoint of anytime you're creating a memory together. So if you're doing something together, even if you're not, talking or touching or any of those kind of things, you're still creating a memory, and that is building experiential intimacy together.
Right. And actually, I just thought of something. So when we think about experiential intimacy, you could say that watching a TV show is experiential intimacy because you're participating and watching the same thing together. Mm-hmm. But I think that kind of ties nicely into the next form of intimacy that we were going to talk about, which is emotional intimacy. Because a lot of times what we will hear from couples are that, I'm sitting with her, we're literally right next to each other on the couch, we're watching TV together, and she says, we don't spend enough time together. Like, what does she want? I'm literally right here, my arms around her. Like, what can I do? What is missing? Well, I think a lot of times in that situation, what's missing is that emotional intimacy. And that part is basically what it sounds like, which is feeling really known and safe to express how you feel about things, and actually having your partner express interest in knowing deeply, not just on the surface level, but really how you feel, which we talked about that some in the last video where we were talking about ways to enhance some intimacy by kind of checking in with each other.
Communication.
Yeah. So I wonder sometimes where it might be that you are experiencing experiential intimacy, you're doing something together, but then there's still something missing from one side, and that might be emotional intimacy.
Yeah. So, and when we were talking earlier, I had the example of emotional intimacy, something that happened not that long ago. But Megan and I were having a conversation with some other people, and something came up, and it just kind of struck me the wrong way. And I thought it was kind of like stupid. So I put it off, and I was like, I don't want to necessarily bring it up. I don't want to like bug Megan. I don't want to, I don't want her to feel like I'm critiquing her or whatever. But then it was like the next day, I was still thinking about this specific situation, this kind of series of events. So what I ended up doing was I ended up talking to you about it. And I just, I tried to have a gentle startup and introduce it in a way that wasn't critical. But at the same time, I just said, hey, this thing happened and I'm thinking about it and I just want you to know how I feel and all that kind of communication that transpired after that. And I mean, I think that essentially what I was doing without really thinking about it too much, but I was trying to maintain a sense of emotional intimacy because had I not felt safe in our relationship, secure enough to be able to talk to you, secure enough to be vulnerable, then I probably would have kept pushing it off. And that would have kept us from being able to have that emotional intimacy to where we were able to talk about it. And, I think after we kind of were able to talk through it, you probably felt more connected to me. I know I felt more connected to you. And I don't think that you necessarily felt like I was coming at you. I hope you didn't.
No. And I think that's one of the things that I like is that because I feel so secure in our relationship, and I know that we do have really good emotional intimacy, is that I feel like it means I can come to you with like insecurities or gently talk to you about things that, maybe I'm questioning or wondering about that maybe aren't even realistic, but I know that you are going to listen for the emotion that is going on and like really try to be present. And that just really builds in that closeness, like especially not just talking about the good emotions, but really what you're struggling with and letting someone else be a part of that internal dialogue, I think is really important. So that's,
So that kind of leads us into the last form of intimacy, which is intellectual intimacy. So intellectual intimacy is talking about stuff, but it's not necessarily from the emotional side. Do you want to talk about intellectual?
Yeah. So emotional is anything to do with emotion. And then obviously anything that would be intellectual would be like when you're sharing ideas with your partner. Now, this could be about like plans that you have. It could be politics, religion. I mean, of course, there's lots of things to have opinions on that are personal to you, and you might not agree. And I think that's where you really build in safety, is being able to talk about things that you may not agree with, but instead of being told, well, you're wrong, that's just not right, that you can actually have that conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things to me about the intellectual intimacy is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with your partner when you're talking to them about stuff. I think that there are a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this, where I feel like if we don't agree about something, then that means that there's some level of like broken intimacy.
Yeah.
But I think that, through the research and everything that we know about this, actually the opposite's true. If we do have this kind of environment where we feel safe and connected and can talk, then we can disagree about things, share our opinions in a supportive environment, and we actually build intimacy through that, even through a disagreement, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is that all of these are sort of interconnected. So if you have an idea about something and your spouse doesn't agree with you, and the response that you get when you share how you feel on an intellectual level about something is to be dismissed, is to be told you're wrong, that's not true, to be almost to receive that information and be given like defensiveness,
Mm-hmm.
it just really can corrode the emotional intimacy. Because if you tell someone what you think about something, the person that really should be closest to you, you tell them how you feel about a topic and they tell you basically that you're wrong, then there's no way that doesn't hurt your emotional side.
Right.
Which could mean that you then shut down emotionally to your spouse because of what happened when they rejected you on the intellectual side.
Yeah. Well, and kind of like what you're saying, I think that all of these different types of intimacy really play on each other. And like you were saying, so I think that everybody has a different level for each of those four, and each couple is going to have like a unique level. One person may value experiential more, just like being around their partner, versus the intellectual or emotional. Other people are going to have a different range of emotions. But I think when you find that intimacy is missing, I think it's really important to try to be aware, and then ask your partner about the different four. And if you guys can kind of pinpoint one area that is not doing as strongly as the others, if you work to improve that specific area, then I think intimacy overall increases.
Right. And again, it doesn't look the same for probably any two couples. I mean, for Clay and I, emotional intimacy is probably very high at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that's where you have to be able to know yourself really well. So if you're dating, you're not married, then if you understand the levels of intimacy and know yourself well enough, then you might know emotional intimacy is my priority. I want someone that can actually talk to me about emotions, will be present for me in that way. Whereas some other people are more intellectual and they might be okay with that. And that doesn't mean that anything is wrong with the couple, but they both need to be in sync. That's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
So really just talking to your partner about the four different types and just asking, what is a priority for you and where do you think we lie in each of these areas, and what maybe could we do to improve that? That will only help your relationship, because as we will always say, a good relationship, it takes work, but it's worth it. And you have to be willing to check in and not just allow things to become static, because that's how things corrode over time.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I was just thinking is that this is applicable not just to like intimate relationships, but also with friends or family. If, you might not feel comfortable just sitting down and with a friend and being like, hey, what is your, favorite type of intimacy? But at the same time, if you're aware of the four different types, you can kind of pick out, different friendships and say, hey, I'm really, intellectually close with this person. This person's more experiential, and you can build that friendship by giving it, what that person's most comfortable with. So it's good to know too.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So one of the things that I'm thinking about before we close out is that one thing that we love about social work is that it can make us better when we really take the principles to heart. And I think once you are looking at intimacy and the different types and evaluating it in your own relationship, one thing you really have to make sure you do is to evaluate where you are on a personal level with all the four types. Because if you've had abuse in your past, it's possible that you might really struggle with physical intimacy. Or if you've had any kind of emotional abuse in your past, you may have a deep-seated fear of abandonment, of rejection, and which keeps you from fully being intimate with your partner emotionally, because you're so afraid of the other shoe dropping. And I think that's a very good example of why it's really important, if you notice some of those things, it being difficult in certain areas of intimacy for you, to really get with a mental health professional, find a good therapist, and work through some of those past traumas that you've been through so that you can be the best partner in your relationship. Because sometimes what I see is that the person, there'll be one person who wants to put it all on the other spouse to do the work or to change. And in reality, yes, they do need to do work, but also we always need to do our own work too.
Mm-hmm.
And we would call that that's really like a one word for it is shadow work, like looking at the past and really delving into that. And it's really important. So while we say you need to talk to each other about intimacy and where you are, you also need to think about where you are in all of the levels and
Right.
how healthy you feel in each area, because we're not perfect, right? I mean, we're going to have areas where we're insufficient, and we always have to be trying to strive to be the best version and the most healthiest version of ourselves.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's important for us to kind of self-evaluate, figure out where maybe some negative patterns have arisen, and figure out what the barriers are, what specific stuff's getting in the way, like Megan said, if it's abuse, if it's trauma. So we hope that this talk was helpful. We hope that you got something out of it, and look forward to talking to you guys next time.
Yeah.